They say the heaviest things we carry don't have a physical weight. They say if you spend enough time in the dark, you stop looking for the light, you just learn to navigate by the shadows. I used to think the scariest monsters were the ones hiding under the bed, but I was wrong. The truly terrifying ones sit in your living room, wearing the faces of the people who are supposed to love you. Listen closely, because I need you to understand exactly how quiet the end of a family really is. It doesn't happen with a screaming match. It happens in the dead silence of a Tuesday evening, with a melting piece of chocolate and a locked gaze. It was mid-November, the kind of night where the rain doesn't fall so much as it hangs in the air. A freezing mist that clings to your skin and sinks straight into your bones. I was walking through the front door after an exhausting 8-hour shift at the local hardware store. My boots were soaked, my fingers were numb, and the house was pitch black except for a single, sickly yellow lamp glowing in the living room. In my right hand, I was holding a small chocolate cake I had bought myself from the grocery store bakery. It was pathetic, really. It cost me exactly $6. Across the top, it had happy birthday written in an artificial blue frosting that was already smearing from the suffocating humidity of the store. It wasn't much, but for a fleeting moment it was mine. I pushed the heavy oak door shut behind me, the click of the lock echoing through the unnatural silence of the house. I kicked off my boots, expecting the familiar, agonizing quiet that usually greeted me. Instead, as I turned the corner into the living room, I froze. My parents, Patricia and Dennis, were sitting side by side on the worn leather couch with my sister, Clara. They were positioned perfectly, deliberately, like some kind of twisted intervention setup. The air in the room was thick, metallic. You could almost taste the anxiety. The second my boots hit the threshold, my mother looked up. There was no warmth in her eyes. There wasn't even pity. It was an expression of practiced disappointment, a mask she had perfected over 2 decades of treating my existence as a mild inconvenience. "Blake," she said. Her voice didn't waver. It was flat, clinical. "We've decided there won't be any birthday celebration this year." I stood there, the plastic dome of the cake container digging into my palm. I didn't say a word. I just waited for the punchline that I knew wasn't coming. "Clara has been feeling overshadowed lately," Patricia continued, her hand reaching out to stroke my sister's shoulder. "She needs the family's full attention right now. You understand?" It wasn't a question. It was a command, a statement of fact. My feelings on the matter were completely irrelevant, just background noise to the main event of Clara's life. I shifted my gaze to my sister. Clara sat there, clutching a throw pillow to her chest, looking appropriately distressed. Fake tears were already forming in the corners of her eyes, glistening in the dim lamplight. To anyone else, she would have looked like a fragile, broken bird in desperate need of a safe nest. But I saw the subtle tightening of her jaw. I saw the way her fingers dug into the fabric of the pillow, not in sorrow, but in anticipation. There was a cold, calculating glint behind those forced tears. It was a look of pure, unadulterated control. This was the moment something fundamental clicked in my brain. For years, I had convinced myself that I was just the invisible child, the quiet one, the one who slipped through the cracks while the golden child soaked up the sun. But as I stared at my father, Dennis, who couldn't even meet my eyes, opting instead to stare down at his calloused hands as if they held the secrets of the universe, I realized this wasn't just about neglect. This wasn't just another instance of me being invisible in my own family. This was something much darker. This was fear. My parents weren't canceling my birthday because they loved Clara more. They were doing it because they were terrified of what she might do if they didn't. They were hostages in their own home, paying a psychological ransom to a 21-year-old girl who had learned exactly how to pull their strings. And my birthday, my pathetic, $6 existence, was just the latest currency they were using to pay her off. This was the final straw in a lifetime of being erased. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't ask them why I wasn't enough. The heavy, suffocating weight of that realization pressed down on my chest, sealing the words in my throat. I simply stepped forward, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, and set the smudged, blue frosted cake down on the glass coffee table. It landed with a soft, hollow thud. Without a single word, I turned my back on the 3 of them. I could feel their eyes burning into my spine as I walked away, retreating into the cold shadows of the hallway. I walked straight to my tiny room at the back of the house. I shut the door, locked it, and pulled a battered duffel bag from beneath my bed. I started packing everything I owned. I wasn't just leaving for the night. I wasn't running away to throw a tantrum. As the rain battered against my bedroom window, sounding like frantic fingernails tapping against the glass, I realized I was escaping a sinking ship. But to understand the depths of the water we were drowning in, and why that specific night felt like a loaded gun pressed to my temple, You have to understand the ghosts that lived in this house long before Clara learned how to summon them. You have to understand the altars we built to her, and the blood we spilled to keep them clean. Houses have memories. If you sit quietly enough in the dark, you can hear the floorboards groaning under the weight of arguments that happened a decade ago. You can smell the stale anxiety baked right into the drywall. My childhood home never felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a museum dedicated to a living god, and I was just the unseen janitor hired to sweep up the dust. As I packed my bags in the dim light of my bedroom, the suffocating weight of that moment in the living room made perfect sense when I thought about the previous 20 years of my life. To understand the sickness that ate my family from the inside out, you have to go back to the inciting incident. You have to trace the rot back to the roots. Clara is 2 years younger than me. When she was 8 years old, she won some junior beauty pageant. It wasn't anything grand or prestigious, just one of those small, regional competitions that desperate parents convince themselves actually matter. But in our house, it was treated like the coronation of an empress. I remember that day clearly, down to the stagnant smell of floor wax in the high school auditorium, because it was the very last time my parents looked at me with genuine pride. Right before the judges handed Clara that cheap plastic trophy, everything changed. I watched a switch flip behind my mother's eyes. A cold, consuming obsession took root in her soul, and the family I knew was quietly laid to rest. From that exact moment forward, our reality warped. Every family event, every saved dollar, every ounce of parental attention got redirected toward Clara's endless pageants, dance classes, voice lessons, and acting coaches. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a fanaticism, a cult of one. Our house slowly transformed into a shrine to her mediocre talents. I watched it happen, helpless to stop the creeping invasion. My straighter report cards got brief, dismissive nods, while Clara's participation ribbons got meticulously framed and mounted on every available wall. Her glittering, sequined costumes hung in the laundry room like the shed skins of some exotic, venomous snake, constantly reminding me of who really ruled the territory. Every framed photo, every shiny piece of plastic, felt like a tiny tombstone for the childhood I was never going to have. The erasure was absolute. When I got accepted to the state science fair with a project I had spent months developing, my achievement vanished beneath the manufactured excitement of Clara's next competition. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding my acceptance letter with trembling hands, while my mother enthusiastically discussed the rhinestones on Clara's tap shoes. They didn't even hear me speak. It was as if I were a ghost haunting my own life. I adapted. I had to. I learned to celebrate my victories alone in my room, while the living room permanently became Clara's personal stage. But it wasn't just the profound neglect that cast a long, creeping dread over the house. It was the physical toll it took. It was the blood sacrifice required to keep Clara's spotlight burning bright. Dad started working brutal overtime at the local factory just to pay for Clara's expensive competition dresses and travel costs. Before the pageants, he used to be a man who laughed loud enough to rattle the window panes. But the pageants hollowed him out, scooping out his joy until only the shell remained. He would come home looking completely destroyed. His skin took on a gray, translucent quality, like old wax. He would eat his dinner in absolute silence, staring blankly at his plate, and then he would sit on the couch through hours of Clara practicing her routines. I would hide in the darkened hallway, watching them from the shadows. Clara would miss a step or hit a flat note, and my mother's voice would crack through the air like a whip. But Dad, he just sat there, vacant, broken. I watched him age a full decade in 3 years. His shoulders became permanently slumped from the suffocating weight of financial pressure and deep emotional exhaustion. He looked less like a father and more like a prisoner of war who had forgotten what freedom tasted like. As I grew older, the dread in the house deepened into something far more sinister. The endless performances stopped feeling like a child seeking validation and started feeling like something deeply unnatural. Clara would practice her monologues late into the night. I would wake up at 3:00 a.m. to the faint, eerie sound of her voice echoing through the air vents. She wasn't just reciting lines. She was practicing human emotions. "I'm so sorry," she would whisper into her mirror, over and over, testing different inflections. "I just feel so alone." She was building an arsenal. My parents didn't notice the psychological predator she was becoming. Or perhaps they did, and pageants were simply their desperate, terrified attempt to keep the monster entertained. If Clara was busy memorizing lines and learning tap routines, she wasn't turning that calculating, icy gaze onto them. They fed her attention the way you throw raw meat to a starving wolf, hoping it eats the scrap instead of your arm. The house was a shrine of mediocrity, yes, but it was also a containment zone. And as I sat on my bed that rainy November night, pulling the zipper closed on my third duffel bag, I realized the containment had finally failed. The wolf had outgrown her cage, and now she was tearing down the rest of the house. To truly grasp why I walked away that night, leaving my only family behind to stare at a cheap, melting grocery store cake, you have to rewind the clock. What made the birthday night even worse was what I had overheard exactly 3 hours earlier. The sky outside had already turned the color of bruised iron. I had come home early from my shift at the hardware store, my muscles aching, the damp chill of the November storm already seeping through my jacket. The house felt empty. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of lavender plug and air fresheners that my mother used to mask the smell of old dust and unspoken resentments. I was walking softly down the hallway, navigating the creaking floorboards purely by muscle memory. I was a phantom in my own home. But as I passed Clara's bedroom, my footsteps slowed to a halt. Her door was cracked open just an inch, casting a thin, sharp sliver of artificial white light across the shadowed hardwood floor. From within, I heard her voice. It wasn't her normal speaking voice, nor was it the fragile, tearful whisper she used on our parents. It was dripping with that sickly, fake sweetness she'd exclusively used when spinning mice to her friends. I stood frozen in the hallway, scarcely daring to breathe, as the darkness of her true nature finally spilled out into the light. "Yeah, I already told Mom that I need extra attention right now," Clara was saying, letting out a soft, conspiratorial giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke. The rhythmic drumming of rain against the hallway window was the only other sound in the world. "I mean, Blake's birthday is tomorrow, but who cares?" Clara continued, her tone dripping with casual venom. "I told them I've been feeling really depressed and overlooked. Mom bought it completely. She's going to tell him tonight that we're not celebrating because I need family support." My chest tightened. The air in my lungs turned to ice. She was staging an emotional crisis. But it was her next words that made the floor drop out from beneath my feet, plunging me into a chilling reality I had never even suspected. "The best part is that nobody knows I flunked out of college 3 weeks ago," she whispered, her voice dropping an octave, losing its honeyed glaze and turning dead, flat, and terrifyingly cold. "That dismissal letter from the registrar is going to arrive any day now. But by then, I'll have convinced them that I dropped out because I was too stressed from the family focusing on Blake instead of me." She paused and then she laughed. It was that cruel, hollow little sound I had heard 1,000 times before. "Can you believe he still lives here at 23? What a loser." I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingernails digging so hard into my palms that they broke the skin. The humiliation burned, but it was quickly overshadowed by a rising tide of pure horror as Clara kept speaking. "By the time that letter arrives, they'll be so worried about my mental health that they won't even care about the $40,000 they wasted on my tuition." She let out a sharp sigh. "Not that the money actually went to the school. If the registrar ever tells them what the settlement was really for, if they ever find out what I had to pay that girl to keep her mouth shut and make the police reports go away, well, it doesn't matter. They won't look into it. They're too terrified of me falling apart. $40,000. The number echoed in the narrow, shadowed hallway like a gunshot. They had sat me down at the kitchen table years ago, their faces drawn and stern, and told me they couldn't help with my college expenses because money was too tight. They watched me work graveyard shifts and scrub toilets just to afford my textbooks, but behind closed doors, they had handed over $40,000 to Clara for an education she had completely thrown away or worse, used as a massive slush fund to bury some unspeakable, violent secret at her university. I felt something break inside me in that exact moment. It wasn't a loud, dramatic snap. It was a quiet, terminal fracturing. Something that had been cracking under the immense pressure of their neglect for years finally shattered completely. So, when I walked into the living room 3 hours later with that pathetic, store-bought chocolate cake and saw them all sitting there in their twisted little tableau, ready to cancel my birthday for Clara's manufactured crisis, the picture was crystal clear. I knew exactly what was happening. Clara had orchestrated this entire emotional hostage situation to deflect from her academic failure and whatever nightmare she had unleashed on campus. She was brilliantly, ruthlessly using my birthday as a distraction, turning herself into a bleeding heart victim before the agonizing truth could come out. She was playing my parents like worn-out violins, and they were too exhausted, too terrified, or too deeply in denial to see the monster standing at the conductor's podium. As I stood in my bedroom now, zipping up the final canvas duffel bag, the house felt entirely different. It wasn't just a shrine of mediocrity anymore. It was a crime scene. It was a tomb built on a foundation of $40,000 in hush money and a lifetime of psychological torture. My room looked strange as I packed the last of my belongings. Stripped of my few posters and books, it was finally revealing what it had always been to this family. A temporary storage closet rather than a home. My entire life fit into 3 bags. That was what 23 years of breathing this toxic air amounted to. 3 bags and a college acceptance letter. I slung the heavy straps over my shoulders. Outside, the storm was escalating, the wind howling against the siding of the house like a chorus of angry ghosts. I didn't know where I was going to sleep tomorrow. I didn't know how I was going to survive. But as I placed my hand on the cold brass doorknob of my bedroom, preparing to step out into the hallway one last time, I knew one thing for certain. If I stayed in this house for one more night, whatever darkness Clara was hiding in her closet was eventually going to drag me down into the abyss with her. The silence of a sleeping house is usually peaceful, but that night, the silence felt like holding your breath underwater. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark, my 3 packed bags sitting by the door like stone gargoyles, just waiting for the clock to give me permission to leave. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway around midnight. They were slow, dragging, hesitant. They stopped outside my room. A moment later, Dad knocked softly on my door. I didn't turn on the light. I just reached over, turned the deadbolt, and opened the door an inch. He stood there in the shadows, looking older than his 48 years, his shoulders hunched and his eyes terribly tired. For a fleeting, foolish second, the little boy inside me thought that maybe he had come to his senses. Maybe the suffocating guilt had finally outweighed his fear of my mother, and he was ready to stand up for me. Instead, he slowly reached into his back pocket, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and handed me 5 crumpled $100 bills. I stared at the wrinkled green paper in his trembling hand. It felt dirty. It felt like a payoff. "This is all I have right now," he said quietly, his voice barely a rasp over the sound of the rain outside. "I know things aren't fair. I know we failed you, but I don't know how to fix it anymore. Your mother, Clara, I just don't have any fight left." He was offering me a severance package, $500 to erase 23 years of his cowardice. It was more money than he had ever given me for anything, and the agonizing reality that it came with an apology for my entire childhood somehow made it 1,000 times worse. "Thanks," I said flatly, taking the bills because I knew I was walking into the abyss and I would need them. "Where will you go?" he whispered. "Does it matter?" He looked like I had physically slapped him across the face, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, his shoulders somehow slumping even further, and walked away into the dark. I waited 2 more hours, listening to the rain beat against the glass. I left at 2 a.m. While everyone was asleep. I carried my life out the front door, threw my bags into the trunk of my beat-up Honda Civic that had 187,000 miles on it, and drove into the storm. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. The streets were slick and empty, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights like spilled oil. I was heading to the one place I knew I would be welcome, Grandpa Walter's small house across town. Walter was Dad's estranged father, a man the family rarely spoke of because he had adamantly refused to financially support the toxic circus of Clara's pageant dreams. He was a hard, quiet man who saw the world exactly as it was. I pounded on his heavy wooden front door, the freezing rain soaking through my jacket. A minute later, the porch light flicked on. Walter opened the door in his thick plaid bathrobe, took one look at my bags and my pale, shivering face, and simply stepped aside to let me in without asking a single question. That was the thing about Walter. He didn't need a tearful explanation. He understood instantly. "Birthday went well, I take it," he said dryly, turning his back and heading straight to the kitchen to make hot chocolate. I sat at his small, scarred kitchen table, my hands trembling as I wrapped them around a steaming mug. And then the dam broke. I told him everything. I told him about the canceled birthday, the fake tears, and the 5 crumpled bills my father had used to buy his conscience. And then, my voice dropping to a whisper, I told him about the conversation I had overheard in the hallway, the academic dismissal, the manufactured breakdown, and the $40,000 in hush money. Walter listened without interrupting once. His weathered hands were wrapped tightly around his mug, his jaw working furiously, grinding back and forth like he was physically restraining himself from saying what he really thought. When I finally ran out of words, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Walter was quiet for a long, agonizing moment. Then he stood up, but he didn't offer me the platitude. He didn't just tell me it would be okay. He walked out of the kitchen and went into his locked study down the hall. I heard the heavy clunk of a metal safe turning. A minute later, he returned carrying a thick, battered leather binder. It looked ancient, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and dust. He set it down on the table between us with a heavy thud. "You can stay here as long as you need," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "The spare room's yours. No rent, no conditions. Just promise me you'll finish college and make something of yourself." "I promise," I breathed out. "Good," Walter said, tapping his thick, calloused index finger against the leather binder. "Because the best revenge is living well. But survival requires knowing exactly what kind of monsters you're dealing with." He flipped the binder open. My breath caught in my throat. Inside were newspaper clippings, financial statements, and handwritten notes. Some of the pages were decades old, yellowed and brittle. "Your father thinks he's hiding a tragedy," Walter murmured, flipping past a meticulously documented timeline of my mother's spending habits. "But I've been watching Patricia since the day he married her. And when Clara was born, I started watching her, too. I knew the pageant obsession wasn't just a hobby. It was camouflage." He stopped on a page containing a copy of a police report from a town 2 hours away, dated 4 years ago. The name of the victim was redacted, but the suspect's description was chillingly familiar. $40,000 isn't tuition, Blake," Walter said softly, his eyes locking onto mine, dark and serious. "It's a settlement, and it's not the first one they've paid. Your sister didn't just flunk out of college. She destroys people. She consumes them. And your parents are bankrupting their souls and their bank accounts to clean up the blood." I stared at the pages, a cold, sickening dread pooling in my stomach. The house I had just left wasn't just a toxic environment. It was a factory of collateral damage, and I was the only one who had managed to escape before getting caught in the gears. I looked up at Walter. In the dim light of his kitchen, he didn't look like an old man. He looked like a watchman on the wall, handing me a loaded weapon for a war I didn't even know I was fighting. "Sleep tonight, boy," Walter said, closing the binder with a definitive snap. "Tomorrow, we start building your armor." Have you ever stood alone inside an abandoned house? The air in a dead home doesn't circulate. It settles. It tastes like copper and dust, heavy with the memories of whoever fled its walls. Over the next 3 years, I would learn exactly what it takes to bring a dead house back to life. But I would also learn that some things buried in the foundation are better left undisturbed. That spare room in my grandfather's house became my launching pad. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I worked full-time at the hardware store, attended college classes, and spent every other waking moment absorbing everything Walter knew about real estate investment. He had dabbled in property renovation decades ago, and under the harsh glow of his kitchen pendant light, he taught me how to find undervalued properties, budget renovations, and maximize rental income. He also revealed the secret college fund he had been building for me $8,000. It was enough to cover a year's tuition if I stayed local and worked myself to the bone. I did exactly that. By maxing out my credit hours and taking summer classes, I finished my degree in 3 years. But victory in my life has always demanded a terrible toll. Just as I was finding my footing, standing on the solid ground Walter had built for me, the earth gave way. Walter got sick. It was stage 3 cancer by the time the doctors found it. He was stubborn as hell, refusing aggressive treatments because he wanted to die on his own terms, not wasting away in a sterile hospital bed. I spent my final semester taking care of him. And when he passed away peacefully in his sleep, he left me everything he had, his house, his modest savings, and his old truck. Along with his will, he left a note that read, "Use this foundation to build something beautiful. Don't let them pull you back down." I was entirely alone now, but I was armed. Using Walter's savings and every penny I had scraped together from the hardware store, I began hunting for my first deal. I found a foreclosed property through a bank auction listing. It was a 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood that had been sitting empty for 8 months. The grass in the front yard was waist-high, the exterior paint was peeling off in jagged strips, and the interior looked like a war zone abandoned mid-renovation by someone who had run out of money and hope. The bank was desperate to offload it, asking $52,000. I offered $47,000, expecting a counter, but they practically threw the keys at me, accepting $45,000 within 24 hours. At 24 years old, I owned my first piece of the world. The next few months were a brutal, exhausting blur. I worked my day job, then drove to the dead house and worked until midnight, ripping out disgusting carpets and patching drywall. I learned basic plumbing and electrical work by watching YouTube videos and calling in favors from contractors I knew from the hardware store. My hands were perpetually blistered, my lungs filled with drywall dust, but I was building something real with my own hands. It was during the third week of renovations that the house started fighting back. I was working in the master bedroom, tearing down a section of rotted, water-damaged drywall behind the closet. The crowbar bit into the plaster, bringing down a massive sheet of gray dust and debris. As the wall crumbled, something metallic clattered onto the exposed oak hardwood floor. I wiped the sweat from my brow, shining my heavy yellow flashlight into the cavity between the studs. There was a small, rusted lockbox sitting entirely concealed within the wall framing. It hadn't been left there by accident. It had been intentionally entombed. A freezing sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I knelt in the dust, the silence of the empty house pressing in on my eardrums, and picked up the lockbox. It was heavy. The flimsy lock was already half corroded, so I used the edge of my crowbar to snap the hasp open. Inside were no treasures, no cash, just a thick stack of manila folders, wrapped tight in degraded rubber bands, and a collection of burnt Polaroid photographs. I peeled back the brittle rubber bands. The first document was a property deed. I scanned the faded print, expecting to see the names of strangers. Instead, the letters burned themselves into my retinas. The previous owners of this house, the ones who had supposedly abandoned it mid-renovation and let it fall into foreclosure, were a family named the Millers. The Millers were the parents of the girl whose name had been heavily redacted in Walter's black binder, the victim of Clara's incident from 4 years ago. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I flipped open the next folder. It contained copies of bank transfers, legal threats, and a very specific contract. It was a non-disclosure agreement, and sitting clearly at the bottom of the page, signed in that elegant, looping cursive I had seen on 100 fraudulent birthday cards, was my mother's signature. Patricia hadn't just paid the $40,000 settlement. She had systematically bought out the Miller family's debt, leveraged their mortgage through a shell company, and aggressively forced them into foreclosure to run them out of town completely. This wasn't just a random distressed property. This was the scene of my mother's quiet, financial murder. And the bank had just unwittingly sold the murder weapon to me. I sat there in the dark on the refinished oak floors, the flashlight casting long, jagged shadows against the exposed studs. The air grew icy. I wasn't just fixing up houses. Without realizing it, I had stepped blindly into the exact graveyard where my parents had buried their sins. And looking at the burnt Polaroids, images of a young girl's bedroom utterly destroyed, the walls smeared with something dark, I realized Clara wasn't just a spoiled pageant girl throwing tantrums. She was something deeply malignant, and my parents weren't just enablers. They were the cleanup crew. I carefully placed the files back into the rusted box. I knew I couldn't go to the police, not yet. The statute of limitations, the NDAs, the convoluted paper trail my mother had woven, it was too thick. But Walter had said the best revenge was living well and building an armor they couldn't penetrate. I was going to do more than that. I was going to buy up every piece of earth they had poisoned, rebuild it in the light, and when the time was right, I was going to use it to bury them. Time is a strange, distorted thing when you are trying to outrun your own blood. You trick yourself into believing that if you put enough miles, enough poured concrete, and enough locked deadbolts between yourself and the past, it will eventually stop hunting you. But trauma doesn't die of old age. It doesn't forget your scent. It just waits in the dark, patiently sharpening its teeth in the shadows of your mind. For years after I found that rusted lockbox in the walls of the Miller house, I buried myself entirely in mortar, drywall, and spreadsheets. I became a ghost haunting my own life, but this time it was a haunting of my own design. By the time I turned 26, I owned 3 rental properties. By 28, I had 7. And by 30, I was running a small real estate investment company with 15 properties generating consistent monthly income. I had taken the exact same stubbornness my family used to hate about me and weaponized it to build an empire. I worked until my hands bled and my vision blurred, filling the agonizing silence of my grandfather's empty house with the constant noise of construction and commerce. It was a cold, solitary existence. During those years of building, my family made sporadic attempts to contact me. The phone would ring on holidays, and my mother would leave breathless, weeping voicemails about healing family wounds and letting go of past hurt. Flora would occasionally find me on new social media accounts, sending carefully crafted messages about how much she had grown and how deeply sorry she was. I ignored all of it. I never responded to a single message, not out of petty spite, but because they belonged to a life I had left behind. Engaging with them, even to tell them to rot, felt like trying to have a conversation with dangerous strangers about someone else's problems. I had built a fortress around my mind, and I refused to lower the drawbridge. But the silence couldn't last forever. The monster always gets hungry again. It happened on a freezing Tuesday night in late November. I was alone in my office, a converted commercial space on the industrial edge of town. The street outside was dead, blanketed in a thin, shimmering layer of black ice. The only sound in the world was the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the overhead HVAC unit and the scratching of my pen against a ledger. Then, at exactly midnight, there was a knock. It wasn't a frantic, desperate pounding. It was 3 slow, deliberate, heavy taps against the reinforced glass of the front door. Tap, tap, tap. My blood turned to ice water. The pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the mahogany desk. I stood up slowly, the leather of my chair creaking loudly in the empty room. I glanced up at the security monitors mounted on the wall. The camera feed showed the front entrance, bathed in the sickly, flickering orange glow of the street lamp. The sidewalk was completely empty. There were no cars parked on the curb. There were no footprints in the frost gathering on the pavement. I walked to the front door, my pulse hammering in my throat, echoing in my ears like a war drum. I disengaged the heavy deadbolt and pushed the glass door open. The freezing night air bit into my face, carrying the faint scent of ozone and wet asphalt. I stepped out onto the threshold and looked down the abandoned street. Nothing, but lying there on the bristled welcome mat, perfectly centered, was a crisp, white envelope. It didn't have a stamp. It had been hand-delivered in the dead of night. I stared down at it. My name was written across the front in an elegant, looping cursive. The ink was dark blue. It was my mother's handwriting. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, thick and suffocating. I brought the envelope inside, locked the door, and carried it back to my desk like it was an unexploded bomb. I held it over the trash can. I almost threw it away unread. I wanted to watch it burn, but a dark, creeping intuition, a whisper from Walter's ghost, forced me to slide my silver letter opener beneath the flap. I pulled out the folded pages. The paper smelled faintly of the cheap lavender perfume she used to spray around our house to mask the scent of decay. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. It was 3 densely packed pages detailing how she had always loved both her children equally. It was a labyrinth of toxic excuses, describing at length how she had been doing her absolute best in incredibly difficult circumstances. She went on and on about how Clara had really changed and was now working so hard to become independent. There was no actual apology anywhere in the ink. There was no acknowledgement of the cruelty, the erasure, or the night I walked out into the storm. It was just a relentless barrage of explanations and justifications, all neatly wrapped in her sickening victim language. I read it with a detached, clinical disgust, but it was the last paragraph that made the breath catch in my lungs and the room suddenly spin. The kicker: we're having financial difficulties right now. The cursive looped aggressively across the page, pressing so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. Your father's overtime got cut, and Clara has been struggling to find stable employment. We could really use your help. I know you've been doing well in real estate. Maybe you could give us some advice or help with a loan. Family helps family, Blake. That's what we do. There it was, the mask slipping entirely, shattering on the floor. The real, terrifying reason for the sudden, desperate interest in reconciliation. They needed money. But staring at that letter, with a terrible knowledge of the Miller family's ruined lives burned into my memory, I knew this wasn't about buying groceries or keeping the heat on in the winter. Clara didn't struggle to find employment because she was unlucky. My father hadn't just gotten his overtime cut. The hush money was drying up. Whatever horrific, convoluted financial arrangement my mother had orchestrated to cover up Clara's atrocities was finally collapsing under its own weight. The people they were paying off were demanding more, or perhaps Clara had finally slipped the leash again and found a brand new victim to torment. They were drowning. The black water was rising above their heads, and they were looking for a life raft to drag down to the bottom of the ocean with them. They didn't want a son. They wanted an ATM to fund a monster's cover-up. I set the letter down on the cold glass of my desk. The silence in the office was deafening, pressing against my eardrums. I thought back to Walter's dying words. Use this foundation to build something beautiful. Don't let them pull you back down. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a local number. The man on the other end was a private investigator I occasionally retained for complex, hostile title searches on commercial properties. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "It's Blake," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, staring out the dark window at the empty, frozen street. "I need you to look into someone for me." Deep background. Financials, police records, sealed settlements, property liens. Dig until your shovel hits bedrock. Who's the target? He asked, the sound of a lighter flicking in the background. I picked up the white envelope, my thumb tracing the sharp, aggressive edge of my mother's cursive signature. Patricia and Dennis, I whispered into the receiver, and a 26-year-old woman named Clara. It's time to find out exactly how much blood is soaking into my family's floorboards. I wasn't going to give them a loan. I was going to give them a reckoning. There's a distinct smell to secrets when they are finally exposed to the air. It's a mixture of dry rot, rusted iron, and the sharp, freezing sting of ozone before a lightning strike. It had been exactly 3 days since my mother's letter arrived on my freezing doorstep like a ghost from the grave. In those 72 hours, I hadn't slept. Instead, I had poured every ounce of my manic, terrified energy into my latest project. I had recently sold Walter's house for $180,000, and I used the proceeds to buy a small apartment complex 8 units that needed significant work, but had solid bones. It was an old, historic brick building on the edge of the city limits built in the 1920s, the kind of place with high ceilings, thick walls, and a history of holding its breath. I was spending a year renovating the units, working late into the night beneath the harsh, blinding glare of halogen work lights. The physical labor was the only thing keeping my mind from spiraling into the abyss of my family's darkness. It was 1:00 a.m. on a Friday. I was in Unit 4, working a crowbar under a section of ancient, warped baseboards. The wood groaned and splintered in the empty, echoing room. My private investigator, Vance, was supposed to call me with an update. Instead, he showed up in person. I heard the heavy thud of his boots on the hardwood before I saw him. Vance was a shadow of a man wrapped in a long wool coat, smelling of stale coffee and cheap tobacco. He didn't say a word as he walked into the center of the living room. He just tossed a massive, bloated manila folder onto a folding table I was using as a makeshift desk. The folder hit the cheap plastic with a sound like a gavel striking a block. "You told me to dig until my shovel hit bedrock, Blake," Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the whistling of the wind against the drafty windows. "I broke 3 shovels. What's buried under your family tree isn't just dirt. It's a goddamn landfill." I slowly put the crowbar down. The heavy iron felt cold against my blistered palms. I walked over to the table and stared at the thick stack of papers spilling out of the folder. "Your mother didn't write that letter because your father's overtime got cut and Clara has been struggling to find stable employment," Vance said, leaning against the bare drywall. "She wrote it because they are exactly 14 days away from a total, catastrophic foreclosure on your childhood home. They are bankrupt, Blake. Functionally, legally, and entirely bankrupt." I frowned, tracing the edge of a printed bank statement. Dad worked his hands to the bone. "How did they burn through everything?" "They didn't burn it," Vance corrected softly. "They bled it out. Death by 1,000 cuts." Vance reached out and tapped a series of highlighted ledger entries. "Remember that $40,000 settlement you told me about? The one from Clara's college days? That wasn't an isolated incident. That was a subscription fee." I felt the air in the room suddenly thin out, making it hard to draw breath. I looked down at the documents. They weren't just bank statements. They were copies of sealed civil complaints, restraining orders that had been quietly withdrawn, and non-disclosure agreements. Dozens of them. "Clara wasn't just throwing tantrums, Blake," Vance whispered, the horror creeping into his own hardened voice. "She is a psychological predator. She targets people, vulnerable roommates, coworkers, romantic partners. She isolates them. She gaslights them until they start questioning their own sanity. She pushes them right to the absolute edge of the cliff, and then, right before they go over, your mother swoops in with a checkbook." I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring. The names of Clara's victims blurred together into a suffocating list of ruined lives. "Your mother created a phantom LLC," Vance continued, pointing to a corporate registry document. "She took out a reverse mortgage on your childhood home, maxed out 6 different lines of credit, and drained your father's pension to fund it. She used the LLC to essentially buy the silence of these people. She paid off their medical bills, their psychiatric holds, their moving expenses, whatever it took to make them sign the NDAs and disappear." My hands started to tremble. The sheer scale of the sickness was incomprehensible. My parents had transformed my childhood home into a financial engine entirely dedicated to funding and covering up a monster's reign of terror. "But here is the detail that's going to keep you awake for the rest of your life," Vance said, stepping closer. He reached into the inner pocket of his wool coat and pulled out a smaller, secondary folder. He didn't toss this one. He placed it carefully on the table like a loaded weapon. I traced the addresses of the people Patricia paid off. Vance said. A lot of them had to move out of the county. Some moved out of the state. But one of them, a young woman Clara terrorized about 6 years ago, was living in a rental property when the harassment started. Vance pointed a trembling finger at the floor beneath my boots. She lived right here, Blake. In Unit 4. The silence that followed was absolute. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I looked around the gutted apartment, at the exposed brick and the ripped-up floorboards, suddenly feeling like I was standing inside a ribcage. When Patricia forced the girl to leave town, Vance whispered. She used her LLC to quietly purchase this entire 8-unit complex from the original landlord, just to ensure the girl's eviction was ironclad and no one came asking questions. Your mother owned this building, Blake. But when the hush money started running dry last year, the bank foreclosed on it. My mind spun. I had unknowingly bought the property back from the bank. I had walked right into the epicenter of my family's hidden graveyard. My philosophy in business was treating tenants like people instead of revenue sources. My mother's philosophy was treating them like collateral damage to be bought, sold, and erased. Wait, I choked out, a terrifying realization dawning on me. I looked at the baseboards I had been tearing away when Vance arrived. I grabbed my flashlight and the crowbar. I dropped to my knees in the corner of the room, jamming the iron bar into the gap between the floor and the wall. I pulled back with all my strength. The wood screamed and gave way, exposing the deep, dusty cavity beneath the floor joists. I shone the harsh beam of the flashlight into the darkness. There, resting in the thick, gray dust, was a small, ornate wooden box. It was the kind of jewelry box a young girl might keep on her dresser. I reached in with trembling fingers and pulled it out. The latch was broken. I flipped the lid open. Inside were lockets, driver's licenses, a tarnished silver ring, a hospital bracelet, trophies. Clara hadn't just destroyed these people and let our mother pay them off. She had kept pieces of them. She had hidden them in the floorboards of the building our mother secretly owned, a twisted, hidden museum of her conquests. She keeps them, I whispered to the empty room, the absolute horror of the situation crystallizing in my mind. And if this is just what she left behind in one apartment, what the hell is hidden in the walls of the house I grew up in? Vance stared at the box of stolen lives, his face pale in the halogen light. They're drowning Blake. The bank is taking their house in 2 weeks. When they lose that house, the walls come down. And when the walls come down, whatever Clara has buried in there is going to be found. That was why my mother had sent the letter. It wasn't about family helping family. It wasn't about repairing a broken bond. It was a desperate, terrified plea for me to pay off the bank before the house was repossessed, and their horrific, decades-long cover-up was finally exposed to the police. They wanted my money to buy the padlock for the monster's cage. I slowly closed the lid of the wooden box. The fear that had lived inside my chest for 26 years evaporated, replaced instantly by something cold, sharp, and entirely merciless. No more running, I said softly, looking up at Vance. I'm going home. The drive back to my childhood home took 45 minutes, but it felt like I was traveling backward through a century of time. The storm from the night I left seemed to have never truly ended. The rain was still falling, slicking the suburban streets with a cold, greasy sheen. When I finally pulled up to the curb, I cut the engine and just stared through the windshield. The house looked drastically different than it did in my memories. Without the constant influx of cash to maintain its pristine facade, it had begun to rot from the outside in. The paint was peeling, the gutters were sagging, and the front lawn was a tangled mess of overgrown weeds. It looked exactly like what it was, a dying organism, starving to death because it had run out of blood to feed on. I stepped out of my truck, the freezing wind tearing through my coat, and walked up the cracked concrete path. I didn't knock. I just turned the brass handle. It was unlocked. I stepped into the foyer. The smell hit me immediately, the desperate, suffocating scent of cheap lavender air freshener trying to mask the scent of stale anxiety and decay. The house was deathly quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I walked into the living room, my heavy boots thudding against the hardwood, and there they were. My parents, Patricia and Dennis, were sitting in the living room with my sister, Clara, like some kind of intervention setup. It was a perfect, chilling mirror of the night I had walked away. But this time, I wasn't carrying a melting chocolate cake. I was carrying an executioner's axe. Patricia looked up. The practiced disappointment was gone, replaced by a brittle, terrified hope that made my skin crawl. Blake, she breathed, standing up quickly, smoothing down the front of her wrinkled blouse. You came. I knew you would. I knew you'd read my letter. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it became agonizing. Clara shifted on the worn leather couch. She looked appropriately distressed, fake tears already forming in her eyes. She was older now, 26, but she was still playing the exact same script. "I'm sorry, Blake," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with that sickeningly perfect fake emotion. "I know this is hard for you, but I just feel so invisible sometimes, like nobody sees how much I'm struggling. I need to know that this family cares about me, that I'm not just forgotten." Forgotten. She actually said that word. The girl whose victims were buried under non-disclosure agreements and hush money, claiming she was the one who felt erased. Patricia took a step toward me, clasping her hands together. "We're having financial difficulties right now. The bank, they're making a terrible mistake. They want to take the house, Blake. We could really use your help. You're doing so well in real estate. Family helps family, Blake. That's what we do." "Family," I echoed. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at my father. Dennis was sitting at the far end of the couch, staring at his hands, defeated as always. He looked hollowed out, a ghost haunting his own body. He had spent his entire life choosing survival over confrontation, and it had cost him his soul. "You didn't ask me here for family, Patricia," I said, my voice low, cutting through the room like a scalpel. "You asked me here for $40,000. Or is the going rate for silence higher these days?" The temperature in the room plummeted. Patricia froze. Clara's fake tears instantly stopped falling. "I don't know what you're talking about," Patricia stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. I unbuttoned my heavy coat, reached into the inner pocket, and pulled out the small, ornate wooden box I had pried from the floorboards of Unit 4. I stepped forward and set it down on the glass coffee table with a sharp, heavy clack. I placed it in the exact same spot where I had left my $6 birthday cake all those years ago. Clara stared at the box. For the first time in my entire life, I watched the mask slip completely. The fragile, tearful victim vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Her face drained of all color, turning the shade of old parchment. "I bought an 8-unit apartment complex on the edge of town last week," I whispered, leaning over the table, holding Clara's terrified gaze. "Unit 4 needed some renovations. Ripped up the floorboards. Imagine my surprise when I found this little museum of trophies hidden in the joists." Patricia let out a strangled gasp, pressing her hand to her mouth. "I know about the LLC, Mom," I said, not breaking eye contact with Clara. "I know about the reverse mortgages. I know about the settlements. You didn't invite me here to save your childhood memories. You invited me here to pay off the bank before they foreclose, repossess the property, and tear down the walls of this house." I paused, letting the implication hang in the dead air. "What's hidden in the walls of this house, Clara? What are you so terrified of the contractors finding?" Silence. A thick, suffocating, absolute silence. Then movement. Dennis slowly raised his head. He looked at the wooden box on the table. He looked at his wife's pale, trembling face. And then he looked at Clara. For decades, he had lived in willful ignorance, pretending the pageants and the crises were just the normal chaos of raising a daughter. But staring at the physical evidence of her atrocities, the carefully constructed dam in his mind finally broke. To my absolute shock, Dennis stood up. His shoulders, permanently slumped for as long as I could remember, suddenly straightened. "I'm getting divorced," he said suddenly, his voice raspy but steady. Patricia whipped her head around to stare at him, her jaw dropping. "Dennis, what are you talking about? We are in a crisis. Filed papers last week," he continued, not looking at her, speaking only to me. "I should have done it years ago, but I kept thinking things would get better. They never did. You can't leave me," Patricia shrieked, the panic finally breaking through her composed veneer. "If the bank takes the house, if the police, I wasted 20 years being afraid of your mother's anger," Dennis said, looking at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of profound regret and sudden, terrifying clarity. "Afraid of making waves, afraid of standing up for what was right. The funny part is, once I finally decided to do it, I realized the only thing I should have been afraid of was wasting more time being afraid." He turned his back on Patricia. He didn't even look at Clara. He walked toward the front door, stopping just beside me in the foyer. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said quietly, the exhaustion heavy in his voice. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough when it counted, when you needed me to be. We can't change the past," I told him, looking into the eyes of a man who was finally waking up from a 20-year nightmare. "But you're here now. That counts for something." He nodded once, opened the front door, and walked out into the rain. He didn't look back. I turned back to the living room. The house of cards had completely collapsed. Patricia had collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands, sobbing real tears this time, born of absolute ruin. Clara was still staring at the wooden box on the table, her eyes wide, realizing that her protective fortress was entirely gone. The bank takes possession in exactly 14 days. I told them, my voice devoid of any pity or anger. It was just the cold, hard truth. I'm not writing a check. I'm not saving you. But I did give Vance the box, and I gave him the addresses of everyone you paid off. He's mailing the contents back to the people you stole them from, along with a copy of the NDAs. What they decide to do with that information, and what the police decide to do when the bank tears this house down, that's out of my hands. Blake, please, Patricia begged, looking up, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. You're our son. No, I replied, stepping backward toward the threshold. I'm the janitor, and I quit. I walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind me. The heavy click of the latch sounded like a vault ceiling shut. I stood on the porch for a moment, letting the freezing rain wash over my face, listening to the muffled, frantic sounds of the monsters inside turning on each other as the water rushed in to drown them. Then, I walked down the path, got into my truck, and drove away, leaving the graveyard behind me forever. When you walk away from a burning building, the first thing you notice isn't the heat fading from your skin. It's the silence. For 26 years, my mind had been filled with the constant, deafening roar of my family's dysfunction. But driving away from that decaying house in the freezing rain, knowing the bank and the police were closing in on my mother and Clara, the silence in the cab of my truck was absolute. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt clean. The hardest part about surviving a family of emotional vampires isn't escaping them. It's learning how to live in the sunlight afterward without constantly checking your pulse. I threw myself into my work, expanding my real estate business into commercial properties, small office buildings, and retail strips. I was wealthy now, not with private jets, but with the quiet, untouchable comfort of a life built on solid ground. It was during one of these commercial acquisitions that I met Natalie. She was the real estate attorney handling the closing on a messy title. She walked into the conference room wearing a sharp suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it weighed more than she did. She was brilliant, direct, and possessed exactly zero patience for nonsense. But more importantly, she understood the mechanics of broken things. She had grown up in a trailer park, raised by a mother who enabled an addict father. Natalie had learned early, just the same as me, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you are actually the ones holding you back. Late one night, as we sat at my kitchen table reviewing contracts, she looked up from the paperwork. The soft amber light caught the exhaustion in her eyes, but her voice was steady as iron. You know what I love about real estate, Blake? She asked, setting her pen down. Buildings don't lie. They don't manipulate. They don't make excuses. Either the foundation is solid or it isn't. Everything is measurable, fixable, improvable. She reached across the table and took my hand. I wish people worked the same way. Natalie became my compass. We didn't just build a life together. We built a fortress of transparency. We got married in a small venue holding exactly 50 people. No family drama, no performance, no pretense. Just two survivors who understood that success wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about building something real that couldn't be taken away, and with her by my side, I finally knew exactly how I was going to close the book on my family's dark legacy. Last year, I decided to honor Walter's memory by opening a community center in the exact same neighborhood where he had lived his entire adult life. I wanted to create a monument to the man who saved me, right in the heart of the city that my mother and sister had spent their lives infecting. I found the perfect location. The building was a massive, looming former warehouse that had been sitting completely empty for 3 years. The previous owner had died, and his heirs had abandoned it, letting it rot just to avoid the property taxes. It was a hollow, echoing cavern of shattered glass and graffiti. Where others saw an eyesore, I saw a sanctuary. I bought the property outright for $180,000. Over the next 8 months, I poured another $400,000 into extensive renovations. The physical labor was an exorcism. Every swing of the sledgehammer, every nail driven into the framing, felt like I was driving a stake through the heart of my past. The space was massive, 12,000 square feet of pure potential. We gutted the interior completely, bringing the decaying structure up to modern building codes, but we meticulously preserved the original exposed brick and heavy timber beams that gave it its soul. I wanted the building to show its scars proudly, proving that something old and weathered could still stand strong. Under Natalie's brilliant direction, the interior transformed from a dark abyss into a beacon of light. We created a state-of-the-art computer lab featuring 20 modern workstations. We built 4 soundproof, private tutoring rooms where neighborhood kids could get one-on-one help with their homework and peace. We designed a massive multi-purpose room that could host everything from job training workshops to community meetings. But the heart of the building was the commercial kitchen and small restaurant space we added to the ground floor. Natalie knew that the families in this neighborhood were often food insecure, but she also understood that free handouts came with a heavy psychological stigma. So we designed the restaurant to serve incredible, nutritious food for exactly $1 a plate. It allowed people to maintain their dignity while still getting the help they desperately needed. When the sawdust finally cleared and the heavy wooden doors were polished, I stood outside in the crisp evening air and looked up at the fresh metal lettering mounted on the exposed brick. I named it the Walter Foundation. It was named after the quiet, stubborn man who taught me that true success meant building ladders for others to climb, not pulling them up behind you and watching people drown. At the grand opening ceremony, the streets were alive with energy. Over 200 people showed up, local families, small business owners, and city council members who had fast-tracked our permits. The computer lab was instantly booked solid for the next month. 3 local teachers had already volunteered to run free tutoring sessions, and the restaurant was fully staffed by people from the neighborhood. I stood at the back of the bustling, brightly lit room, listening to the hum of voices and the clinking of coffee cups. It was the exact opposite of the suffocating, terrifying silence of my childhood home. And then I saw him walking through the heavy glass doors. My father. Ennis came to the grand opening, but he wasn't the hollowed-out, gray-skinned prisoner I remembered. He walked taller. The invisible weight that had permanently slumped his shoulders for decades was gone. He came with a woman named Claire, someone who actually looked at him and treated him like an equal. He walked over to me, looking around the massive, thriving community center with tears gleaming in his eyes. "I'm proud of you," he told me, his voice thick with genuine emotion over the ambient noise of the crowd. "Walter would be too." "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he continued, glancing down at his hands, which were finally steady. "But I want you to know I'm trying to be better, to do better." I looked at him. The man who had handed me $500 and told me he had no fight left had finally found his courage. He had survived the collapse of Patricia and Clara's twisted empire, walking away just before the bank took the house and the sirens started blaring. "I can see that," I said, and for the first time in my entire life, I actually meant it. As I watched my father introduce Claire to Natalie, a profound realization settled over me like a warm blanket. My mother and sister had spent their entire lives trying to convince me that I was nothing, desperately trying to erase my existence to protect their own dark illusions. But by shoving me out in the cold, they had unknowingly handed me the keys to the kingdom. While they were busy burying their secrets in the dark, I had learned how to build in the light. The grand opening of the Walter Foundation eventually came to a close, the vibrant noise of the community slowly fading away as the crowd dispersed into the cool autumn night. The heavy glass doors were locked, and the massive, exposed brick room was finally quiet. It wasn't the agonizing, terrifying silence of my childhood. It was the peaceful, exhausted silence of a job well done. Before everyone had left, I stood at the front of the room, looking out at faces that actually cared, and realized something profound. I hadn't just built a building or a business. I had built a life surrounded by people who chose to be there, who showed up, who gave without expecting anything back. During my speech, I talked about Walter and what he taught me about resilience, self-respect, and the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. Walter once told me that the best revenge isn't proving people wrong, I said to the silent, listening room. It's proving yourself right. I told them that when people try to make you small, you don't shrink to fit their expectations. You grow until you outgrow them completely. Some people will try to dim your light because it makes their darkness visible. But when you refuse to shrink for someone else's comfort, you don't just save yourself. You show others that they can choose themselves too. My father had stayed until the very end, helping clean up like a volunteer rather than expecting to be served. As we stacked chairs together in the quiet room, he looked at the empty space that would soon be filled with kids learning and growing, and he offered one last apology. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough when it counted, when you needed me to be. We can't change the past," I told him, matching his gaze, "but you're here now. That counts for something." As Natalie and I finally locked up the building that night and walked out to our car, she took my hand. The streetlights caught the silver of her wedding band. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said something I'll never forget. "You know what the best revenge really is?" she asked softly into the night air. "It's not success or money or even happiness. It's indifference." She was right. Patricia is out there somewhere, still angry, still bitter, still blaming everyone else. I heard through the family grapevine that after the bank took the house and the divorce was finalized, she moved into a tiny apartment. She's working as a receptionist now, still telling anyone who will listen about her ungrateful children who abandoned her. But I rarely think about Patricia anymore. When I do, it's with the kind of detached curiosity you might have about a stranger's problems. Her hold over me has dissolved completely, replaced by the solid foundation of real relationships and earned success. She has moved so far past being a footnote in my story that she is nothing more than a catalyst, a spark that started a reaction she couldn't control. Looking back now, getting banned from my own birthday was the greatest gift my toxic family ever gave me. By denying me birthday celebrations, she taught me to celebrate myself every day. By telling me I was nothing, she motivated me to become something. By erasing me from family photos, she freed me to paint my own portrait. It forced me to stop waiting for them to celebrate my existence and start celebrating it myself. It taught me that you can't earn love from people who see your success as their failure. And most importantly, it showed me that sometimes the best way to honor where you came from is to become everything they tried to prevent you from being. I am 37 now, Natalie, and I have 2 kids of our own. They are growing up in a house where birthdays are fiercely celebrated, achievements are recognized, and love isn't conditional on being better than someone else. We built a home with solid framing and clear glass. There are no secrets buried in our floorboards. But sometimes, on nights exactly like this one when the rain is falling in freezing sheets and the wind howls against the siding, I sit awake in the dark. My childhood home is gone now. The bank foreclosed, and because the structural rot was too extensive to salvage, a development company bought the lot and bulldozed it straight down to the dirt. I don't know what the demolition crew found when the walls finally came down. I don't know if Clara's dark trophies were unearthed, or if they were simply crushed into dust and hauled away to a landfill, burying her sins forever. I never check the police reports. I let the ghosts die in the rubble. Yet, when I drive through quiet, picturesque suburban neighborhoods at night, looking at the perfectly manicured lawns and the soft, warm light glowing from the living room windows, a cold shiver still crawls down my spine. I look at those peaceful, silent houses, and I wonder what kinds of altars are being built in those living rooms. I wonder whose achievements are being erased, whose existence is being cancelled to appease a monster wearing a familiar face. We walk past these houses every single day. We wave to the parents. We smile at the children. We admire the paint. But we never truly know what it costs to keep those lawns so perfectly green. We never know how much blood is mixed into the mortar. The monsters are out there. And the most terrifying part isn't that they exist. It's that they have your key. They sleep down the hall, and they know exactly how to make you apologize for the teeth marks on your own throat.